So let's be clear. If we are going to speak truth to power, the UN Security Council has been dysfunctional, remains dysfunctional, until it is an entity that truly represents the whole world. At this point, the UN Security Council does not represent the world. So yes, they should be ashamed. It is a dysfunctional entity that maybe the inclusion of other nations might actually make it less dysfunctional.
This is the journey to One Africa.
Thank you for having me. This is a very important summit. It's a conversation between the continent and the United States, a conversation that is desperately needed, particularly at this time in our history and in our life. The United States, let me start by saying, it still remains the most preferred trading partner for the African nations. However, like I used to tell the State Department and any engagements that we've had with the United States, I felt during my tenure that the United States was slowly losing ground, and they were risking losing their position as Africa's preferred trading partner. So this is a very important meeting that I hope that if the United States, like I used to tell my colleagues, I felt that the United States, if this was a basketball game, the United States needed to call for timeout. For US needed to realize that this is a new game and it required new rules of engagement, therefore a need for the United States to re-strategize. I'm hoping that for a change, this meeting, the United States can begin to realize it's no longer business as usual. It's no longer a case of the United States saying, we make policy and we tell the Africans. That has got to change. It is a recipe for disaster. It is a recipe for the United States seeing itself losing its place as Africa's preferred trading partner. That's what makes this meeting very important. And I'm hoping that the US can call for timeout and understand that engaging Africa at this time, it is a new game that is calling for new rules of engagement. And therefore, it is time to re-strategize and treat the Africans fairly, treat the Africans respectfully, and treat the Africans as equal partners.
You know, Ambassador, I think one of the things that I'm trying to be sensitive to is that we often over in the United States, as you know, and you were the ambassador of the African Union, tend to talk about a continent as opposed to individual countries and nations, of which there are 54. There are 49 heads of state here in Washington this week. And are we making a mistake? Is our ignorance on our side, from your impression of our ignorance, amplified by us talking about Africa so much as opposed to talking about Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Ghana? Should we be, is our illiteracy in this level so obvious that it's a real problem? And do these kinds of summits that bring everyone together do a disservice to that kind of getting to know each country more distinctly?
I think for the United States, and I'll repeat it, and I used to repeat it all the time during my tenure, what really is behind the failure of effective engagement with Africa is the disrespect of the Africans. That's where the problem begins. If the United States cannot accept Africans as equal partners, if the United States, for example, let's look at this particular meeting, this particular summit. There was no defined agenda. There has never been defined agendas whenever they meet with African countries as individual countries. It's always the United States setting the agenda, the United States setting the policies, and the United States telling the Africans about the policies. That is no way to have any meaningful engagement. If you take, for example, the FOCAC meeting that was held between China and the African heads of state, way in advance, the issues were clearly defined. The agenda was going to focus on trade. It was going to focus on aid. It was going to focus on investments. The African heads of states were engaged in the discussion, in the planning. The outcomes are clearly defined with a way forward in terms of follow-up. It was a fruitful meeting that addressed the issues that needed to be addressed between not only African countries individually with China, but also Africans collectively with China. There is no published agenda. There are no issues that have been presented to the African heads of states. Africans have not been asked to engage in terms of creating the agenda and making sure that when the African heads of states come to Washington, the outcomes, the issues to be discussed are going to be meaningful outcomes with follow-up and deliverables that are going to be beneficial to both. It remains a one-sided conversation with the United States telling the Africans the agendas and the policies. The Africans are not on the table to discuss issues pertaining to us, wherein lies the problem. And the reason that continues to be the case, what underscores that is the disrespect for Africans. I repeated it. I complained about it repeatedly. It is a serious problem. The United States must understand that Africans are not going to take it anymore. If you don't treat the Africans fairly, the United States is going to see itself slowly losing ground to China, to Russia, to all other nations, because without respecting the Africans, without treating the Africans as equal, without understanding that exploitation and abuse of Africa simply cannot continue, this meeting, this summit, is going to be yet another gathering with no outcomes, no deliverables until the next summit. I'm sorry, but the disrespect of the Africans is at the bottom of it all. Agenda for this meeting should have been set out in advance. Africans should have been involved. Without the involvement of the Africans in these discussions, this is a useless meeting. I'm sorry, but that is the fact.
No, I am very grateful for your candor. And it sounds to me, I think there was a lot of criticism of the last summit like this under President Obama, that there was no follow through. And, it's one of the big questions I'm asking is, how do you make a big bang summit where everyone comes over? It's like checking off the box and say, okay, we've done Africa, now we can move on to other things. How do you make that something that's a more sustainable and a more continuous engagement of the United States with Africa? And what I'm hearing from you is, frankly, a lot of disappointment and a lot of pessimism about what may come out of this summit.
Well, the point of the matter is already nothing is going to come out of it because it is a one-sided conversation.
Right.
Where is the agenda? The agenda should have been published way in advance. The African leaders should have been given an opportunity to also state their position so they can come up with an African position that can then be discussed alongside the American position. So the fact that it is a one-sided conversation, that is yet going to be another useless meeting with no outcomes. But again, I'm going to keep emphasizing the reason this is happening is because there is a disrespect for the Africans. There is a general feeling that we don't need to hear from the Africans. Their opinions do not matter. That wherein lies the problem. Why were the Africans not consulted? Why were the Africans not part of an agenda? Why was there not even an agenda like what happened during the FOCAC meeting with China? Those are some basic issues. No head of state. President Biden would not pick up and go to meet with any other leader in the world without an agenda. That simply doesn't happen.
Right.
So what makes the U.S. think that they can engage African leaders without an agenda? Come to Washington, let me tell you what I want to do for you. Come to Washington, let me tell you what you need to do in your countries. That game is an old game.
Right.
It's not going to work anymore. To be honest with you, if I'm to speak the truth, I hope a lot of heads of states don't come because it is an insult. It is an abuse of the African leaders. It's a disrespect of the African leaders. Where is the agenda? Please respect the African leaders. Do unto them what you would want done unto you. So it's really a simple ask.
Let me ask you a question. You mentioned China and how China approaches this. I'm interested in what China gets so right. But is there a blind spot there? Are there problems in the China-Africa relationship from your perspective?
Let me also hit the nail in the head and deal with the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room.
Yeah.
Racism as well plays a very important part. The disrespect of the Africans also goes back to a lot of the people who work in the U.S. government. Not all of them, but there's a significant of them who automatically assume that Africans do not know what they're doing. Africans need help. Africans need to be told what to do. And racism is also at the bottom of it all. We need to address the individuals who are going to be visiting Africa, engaging Africa. They must understand that Africans are equal to them. But when one goes to Africa with a sense of superiority, wherein lies the problem, because you are not going to engage those leaders who are going to come to the table as equals. You go in feeling superior, you come back feeling superior. That is not an issue with the Chinese. The Chinese are coming in. The Chinese, yes, if you don't negotiate with them and they win the game, then that's your fault. But they don't come in feeling superior. They understand that Africa has something they need. So they will come to the Africans. They will come and make sure that they let the Africans know that you matter to us, that our relationship with you does matter. That you don't get that feeling with the United States. You get the feeling that there's this sense of superiority, that you Africans, you ought to be glad that we are engaging you. You ought to be glad that we are inviting you to come to Washington. That sense of superiority, it has to change. Whether it calls for the United States to retrain their people as they engage Africa, but it is that which really goes to the bottom of why the engagements are not going to be as effective. They must take a page out of what Africa is doing. Let me say this. Chinese people didn't used to be that way, but they quickly changed their strategy. When they realized that the game they were playing was not going to work in Africa, they changed their strategy. And that's why, like I said it during my tenure, I'll continue to say it again. If this was a basketball game, the United States need to call for timeout. This is a new game, and it requires new rules of engagement. The United States must, first and foremost, make sure that racism is out of the picture. Africans are just as smart as anybody else. Africans are equal. And until we engage as equals, all these meetings, all these conversations are always going to be useless. And it goes back to the individuals who are going to be at the table with the Africans. So the U.S. also need to address the issue of racism and make sure that the people engaging Africa, their minds are clear and they accept that Africans are equal.
Tell us about Pan-Africanism. Tell us about what Africa, the states in Africa are doing to trade, to connect, to move their agenda forward proactively, no matter what the rest of the world is thinking about it.
Absolutely. I have to say, if you were to go back to 1963, when our Pan-African fathers came together in the hopes of creating an Africa that spoke with one voice, an Africa that had one military, an Africa that had one central bank, one monetary fund, one stock exchange, and an Africa with one customs union. We failed at that over the years. But finally, 2 years ago, they approved the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is a policy that saw Africa coming together in one particular area, that we are now speaking with one voice when it comes to trade. Yes, its implementation is a monster. Yes, its implementation is work in progress. But you can say of the issues that our Pan-African fathers met to discuss in 1963, finally, over 50 years later, we are able to accomplish the first one, which is being an Africa that's going to the world as one customs union. The spirit of Pan-Africanism, it has taken us a long time to really begin to come together, to dismantle the Berlin Conference, which, of course, for those who think, oh, Berlin Conference is a thing of the past, think again. As long as we have a country called Togo, as long as we have a country called Congo-Brazzaville, Eswatini, Malawi, those small countries, even Nigeria or the big ones, Kenya, Egypt, Morocco, they cannot survive on their own. As long as we're talking about the little-bitty individual African countries, we are never going to realize the dream of a united Africa that speaks with one voice. And until we dismantle some of those borders, until we begin to wake ourselves up as a people, until we begin to realize that the colonizers and the rule of divide and conquer left us feeling inferior. Supremacy, white supremacy was introduced from the very onset when the colonizers came to Africa. We were taught to believe that everything African was bad, everything European was better. And we still continue to suffer from that mentality. So yes, while we demand that the West and those who don't look like us Africans treat us equally, realize that we are human beings just like they are, we too as Africans, we have a lot of work to do on a personal level, where we must also believe, truly believe, that we are equal to everybody else on earth and that we are capable. That also is a disease that we need to realize as Africans. Let's wake up and realize that white people are not superior to us. Chinese are not superior to us. We are just as good as anybody else. That is a serious challenge because we still have people, even when you look at issues that we could stand up as a people and push back. You see ministers from the Western world going to Africa, and they basically can. I've seen them say some of the most ridiculous things to the Africans, and instead of the Africans pushing back and saying, "Hey, hold it, this is not going to fly," instead the Africans are afraid, just inherently fear of the white person, for no good reason whatsoever, except that we have been programmed to feel inferior. So on an individual basis, we continue to speak the gospel of truth. We continue to shed the light as to the brainwashing that the African has been put through, wherein lies the problem. When you look at what is being done at the World Bank, for example, the Bretton Woods institutions, the frivolous loans, countries that have never defaulted on their loan repayments, and yet they're still given large interest rates. Why? Countries like the United States that don't need any help, they get loans at zero interest rates. You look at the issue. I'm glad President Biden, I hear he's going to be talking about having the AU as the 51st member of the G20. Well, let's also take it to the next level. Let's go to the United Nations. Let's have Africa, 1.4 billion people. They need to come to the table. Let's African Union be the 6th member of the 5-member UN Security Council. You can't just totally disregard 1.4 billion people because you've gotten away with it for centuries. Well, guess what? Game is over. Africans are waking up. Africans are beginning to realize and understand the game that have been played. Unfortunately, we don't have that critical mass of people who are continuously going to speak truth to power. The good thing with the story of Africa is we are coming from a position of righteousness, a position of truth, a position of facts. Those are constants. They don't change. Let's continue to give the world an overdose of our truth, but at the same time, while we are doing so and demanding a world that is fair, that is just, and free of racism, bigotry, and hate, we must also work on our own development and our own awakening as a people.
Talk to me a little bit about how Africa can take advantage of its intellectual connection and assets to entrepreneurs who have left but may want to help Africa back, because this is one of your major initiatives.
Absolutely. The brain drain that started over 400 years ago, when the best and the brightest and the fittest were taken out of Africa forcibly, and that is when the brain drain started. I want to make sure that is very clear. And when we talk about African diaspora, we're talking about all people of African descent living outside of Africa. Let's be very clear. African Americans, they are Africans who were forcibly taken out of Africa, plus the continued brain drain, those who are later immigrants who left Africa running away from famine, from wars, in search of greener pastures. The end result is, as we speak, Africa has a serious deficit of expertise. However, the good news for Africa is that we have a very young, intelligent, vibrant population that need opportunities. So when we can marry the age group of young, intelligent Africans with the expertise coming from the diaspora, we can see an Africa that can propel itself to take its rightful place on the world stage like it once was. So yes, the diaspora are an important component of Africa's development. Make no mistake about that. All the African leaders are fully aware of that. All the African leaders are in full support of coming up with programs to make it easier for the diaspora to move back. We want to look at diaspora who can come to Africa, not just focus on a country that you were born in, but if you are a person of African descent, Africa should matter to you. Africa should be your problem. You must own Africa's problems, understand it, and participate in the development of Africa. For when we have a stable Africa, it now also correlates with an African American who is anchored. It correlates with an Afro-Caribbean who is anchored. It correlates with an Afro-Latino who is anchored. Right. Currently, descendants of the formerly enslaved, they are like a ship without an anchor. The wind blows that way, here they go. Until they are anchored by being accepted by Africa, until they are anchored by participating in the development of Africa. The Jews do it, the Chinese do it, the Indians do it, the Irish do it, African Americans together with the continental Africans. We must make sure that we work together to participate in the development of Africa, because the development and the building of the Africa we want, it is our responsibility first and foremost, and ours alone. Right. Others are welcome to come join us. Others are welcome to help us. Others are welcome to engage us as equal partners, but we must own the building of the Africa that we want as a united front of the African diaspora.
Well, I want to make a deal with you, Ambassador. I want this to be a start of a conversation with you that we have many other times. I think it's a very important conversation, and I'm grateful to you, Ambassador Arikana Chihombori-Quao, former African Union diplomat and founder of the Africa Diaspora Development Initiative. Thanks for your candor, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, and keep up the good work. These are messages that we must continue to put out, because the average American is not aware. The average European citizen is not aware of what the various Western governments are doing. The atrocities have been going on for far too long. They must come to an end. And your program is doing a great job in getting these messages out. We must inform and educate our citizens.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So what's the bottom line? The smart money's on Africa. That's where the most interesting global action is going to be. Demographically, the West and much of Asia are aging, while Africa has the youngest crowd on the planet. Within a few decades, much of the world's global middle class is going to come from Africa. And Africa is going to become a stickier place for its brilliant innovators to stay, rather than racing off to Europe or the United States. Sure, China and the U.S. will both remain engaged in Africa, but less and less on their terms, and more on the terms of African nations as they rise and become more powerful in their own right. That's the story of unstoppable Africa, rising not because of what nations outside the continent are doing for it, but what it's doing to chart its own course. And that's the bottom line. Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. Why does the U.S. want Africa to have permanent seats on the UN Security Council, but without veto power? Let's get to the bottom line. It's one of the most debated questions in the history of the United Nations. Why do only 5 countries have veto power over all decisions at the Security Council? For almost 80 years, they've been at the top of the food chain. China, France, Russia, the UK, and of course the United States. The world has changed since then, but the UN Security Council has not. Decades ago, the P5, or the Permanent 5 as they're called, decided to allow countries to join as rotating, non-permanent members with no veto. After all, the Security Council is the most powerful body at the UN, with the ability to impose sanctions and to authorize the use of force against countries. And now Washington is talking about creating permanent seats for 2 African nations, but get this, with no veto power. Why? And why now? Today we're talking with Arikana Chihombori-Quao, former ambassador of the African Union to the United States. Ambassador, it's terrific to have you back on our show. I want to start with a film clip of the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Let's listen.
As it stands, there are currently 3 non-permanent seats on the Security Council allocated to African countries on a rotating basis for 2 years. The problem is these elected seats don't enable African countries to deliver the full benefit of their knowledge and voices to the work of the Council. to consistently lead on the challenges that affect all of us and disproportionately affect Africa. That is why, in addition to non-permanent memberships for African countries, the United States supports creating 2 permanent seats for Africa on the Council. It's what our African partners seek, and we believe this is what is just.
Ambassador Chihombori, let me ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how enthusiastic are you about the proposal that the ambassador has just made?
I think it's a step in the right direction. However, keeping in mind that this issue has been on the table, ongoing for, like you said, 80 years. If we are going to right the wrong, why can't we just right this wrong once and for all? If Africa is going to become a member of the UN Security Council, a permanent member, they must have the full rights just like the other 5 members, which means they must have veto power. Inviting Africa to the table and then asking them to remain mute, it's an insult not only to the African leaders, but it is an insult to 1.4 billion people. We appreciate what Ambassador Greenfield is saying. We appreciate the efforts she has made. But if she is going to complete this journey that has been going on for far too long, a journey that clearly exemplifies the continued disrespect of the African continent, Ambassador Greenfield must push for us to take this issue to the finish line. Africa must have 2 permanent seats at the UN Security Council with full veto power. Nothing less is acceptable. And I do believe that the United Nations, understanding how long this issue has been going on, how long the disrespect of the African continent has been going on, it is shameful that the United Nations would want to continue to blatantly disrespect the Africans by inviting them to the table, but then saying, sorry, you can't eat. You can only watch us play our games. You can watch us enjoy the 10-course meal. What a joke. What an insult. And I do hope that the African leaders are not going to accept it. Africa must be at the table as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and the 2 seats must have veto power, plain and simple, period.
Do you think Ambassador Thomas Greenfield doesn't understand this? Do you think, what do you think is behind this offer? When you said, hey, you appreciate the progress she's made, we do know that this was a promise or a commitment that President Joe Biden is trying to fulfill before the end of his term, but do you think they are not aware about how controversial it is to create permanent seats without votes?
Of course they know what they're doing. So, again, that's where the disrespect comes in. They know what they're doing. They know what the right thing to do is. No, we do not want to dilute our veto power if we give 2 more seats with veto power. No, we're simply saying the slice is big enough. The world is bigger than 5 countries representing over 7 billion people. We're simply saying serious wrongs have been perpetrated against Black people. Here is an opportunity for President Biden to right this wrong. This is an opportunity that we cannot miss. Africans must be at the table. 1.4 billion people must be represented. The continued disrespect of the Africans has got to come to an end. So we're asking President Biden and his running mate, Kamala Harris, who I hope will be the next president of the United States, they will right this wrong once and for all. And Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, we understand all the work that you have done. Please, as a sister, as an ambassador, we're asking you to take this issue to the finish line. Permanent positions on the UN Security Council with full veto power like the other 5 Ps.
I've seen that China and Russia are enthusiastic and do support Africa's position on the Security Council with 2 permanent seats. but I have not seen whether they would actually agree to giving the veto to African countries as well. Your thoughts?
Well, normally, like most issues pertaining to Africa, what I've found is that the United Nations usually, sorry, not the United Nations, the United States usually has the final say. If the United States is going to come in and say, we support fully Africa being on the UN Security Council with full veto power, I can assure you the other 4 members will follow suit. The United States, if the United States decides they do not wish for Africa to have veto power, it will not happen. But if the United States decides they do want Africa to have veto power, the other countries, I'm pretty sure, will follow suit.
One of the things that Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the ambassador of the United States to the UN, said about her resistance to giving more countries a veto on this is that it would make the Council more dysfunctional. And it made me wonder whether any nation should have a veto power. Is there a model in the future of the United Nations where we suspend veto power for all countries and we go to majority votes on key decisions?
First of all, I find that comment very, very insulting. You are simply suggesting that the addition of 2 African countries is going to make the process dysfunctional. What an insult. If this particular situation, we're talking a country like Germany, if we're talking any of the other European countries joining as members of the UN Security Council with veto power, would she still find it as a move that will introduce dysfunction? Or is it the introduction of 2 Black African countries that is problematic? What really makes it very sad is that the voices are coming out of the mouth of a Black woman. Those words are coming out of the mouth of an African American who must understand certain language cannot be used, particularly when we're talking about the international platform. To suggest that introducing 2 African countries will introduce dysfunction, it is sad, it is disrespectful, and it will not be tolerated. Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield really needs to retract those words, and she needs to explain herself to say, what do you mean dysfunction? Exactly how are the 2 African countries going to introduce dysfunction, unless, of course, the entity has already been dysfunctional, which in my opinion is the case, and that is what really is the problem with the United Nations. It's a dysfunctional entity. It is a toothless bulldog, and they need to do what they are mandated to do by the world. So yes, no, Africa is not going to introduce any dysfunction at the United Nations. The entity itself has been dysfunctional. Maybe an addition of 2 African countries might straighten it up and create some normalcy, and for a change have an entity that's going to truly represent people of the world. As it is right now, it is a relationship, it is an entity that was designed to steal from the developing nations. It is an entity whose entire purpose and plan and reason for being created was to steal from developing nations. So let's be clear. If we are going to speak truth to power, the UN Security Council has been dysfunctional, remains dysfunctional, until it is an entity that truly represents the whole world. At this point, the UN Security Council does not represent the world. So yes, they should be ashamed. It is a dysfunctional entity that maybe the inclusion of other nations might actually make it less dysfunctional.
Let me ask you to respond to Martin Kimani, who is the former Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations, and he writes, how does having 1 or 2 African countries with veto power further collective African interests? By the time Africa tears itself apart politically to choose those 2 countries, a fight that will be egged on by global powers, we will end up with deep division, possibly in perpetuity. UNSC reform must be preceded by major African Union reform. Your thoughts and reaction to that, Ambassador Chihombori?
With all due respect, I disagree with the brother severely. Africa must be at the table. We must be where decisions are being made. We must be in a position to also disagree or agree on global issues. Yes, while I understand the dysfunction among us as Africans at the African Union, and I've always said this, that at this point, we don't have the right leadership at the African Union. And I'm hoping that with the new elections that are coming up in February of next year, we are going to have an African Union chair with a head over their shoulders. Right now, we don't have any leadership at the African Union. Moussa Faki has failed us. He's a puppet of the West. We all know that. So yes, I agree with him on one end that we do need reform at the African Union. The good thing for us is there are elections coming up. Moussa Faki is going to be gone. And our hope is we're going to have a new chairman of the African Union who understands the issues and is going to reform the African Union where it can truly represent the people. That is where we need. We got our own homework to do. But that doesn't mean we should give out an opportunity to be at the table. So to just run off and say, well, we are dysfunctional at the African Union, and therefore we are not going to demand that seat at the United Nations Security Council, that's actually stupid. We need to be there while we continue to reform our African Union, while we continue to work together. And I can tell you, the African leaders, they work together. The issue is, do we have someone at the African Union who can implement and execute the wishes of the African Union? They have a system, even for choosing the chairman of the African Union. It's on a rotational basis. I don't see the African leaders having any problem deciding which two countries are going to be the first ones. They just use the same rotational process. Right. So no, I disagree with that, Ambassador. Seriously, we need to be at the table. But more importantly, I am so glad that Moussa Faki is leaving, and I'm hoping that the next chairman of the African Union, come February, is going to be a Pan-African who's going to stand up, defend Africa, and represent the continent like we must be represented. We demand that, and I'm hoping that we'll get that come February.
If the United Nations and the Permanent Five are more and more anachronistic, more disconnected from the way power is distributed in the world. And, you know, we haven't even begun talking about India or Brazil or other major states and their roles in the Security Council. Aren't there going to develop ways that you can get around the UN, that Africa can have voice and power in other ways? Why does this debate about the Permanent Five matter so much?
Well, it matters in the sense that there needs to be true representation at the United Nations. The United Nations is not about 5 countries. The United Nations is about all countries of the world. As a matter of fact, the United Nations should have undergone reform a long time ago. So the issue is about having an entity like the United Nations that is controlled by 5 countries where the other countries have no voice, where the other countries, the 5 countries can just veto anything they don't like. I mean, it is so unfair. The fact that in 2024 we're still discussing this, it's just crazy. That just goes to underscore how insane our world is. So yes, what you're going to see is the global South coming together. That is this kind of behavior that is leading to the formation of the BRICS. The global world saying, the global South saying, we have been asking for equity. We've been asking and demanding equality and true representation at the global stage at every level, be it at the United Nations, be it in the financial systems, be it with World Trade Organizations, World Health Organizations. The global South countries are constantly being trampled on. And so it's going to lead to another system that's going to be created where the rest of the world is going to say enough is enough. We're tired of your entities that are not representing us. So to the United Nations and the rest of the Western world, particularly the 5 nations on the Permanent Security Council, they also need to see the writing on the wall and realize that the world is changing. The world is more aware of the geopolitics and what's really going on. And many voices are speaking out as to the wrongs that must be righted. So the sooner they address this issue, the better of the world is going to be. This abusive situation where less developed countries are being taken advantage of and being dictated to, that is not going to continue to work anymore. And the P5 nations must see the writing on the wall and do the right thing, starting with Africa, and then other countries like India, Brazil. They too need to be represented, because they are representing millions of people. So you can't just have 1.4 million people in India being voiceless. So yes, after Africa, we must bring India. That's it. That would be my suggestion. And slowly get more countries. Right now, the United Nations, as it stands, it does not represent the world. They're just using other countries to come to the United Nations so they can say, yes, we were there. You know, it is actually, I have been saying this for years, that if I could influence the African leaders in any way, shape, or form, they need to boycott attending the United Nations General Assembly. There's nothing there for them. They're just coming there to validate other people's issues. So if Africa was to really speak with one voice, they need to boycott the United Nations General Assembly. There's nothing there for them. They're just wasting taxpayers' money, having hundreds of them coming to the United Nations for what? You know? Don't come to the United Nations. Tell the United Nations, if you don't fix this, if we're not members of the UN Security Council, we're not attending UNGA. Plain and simple. But unfortunately, they're not going to do it. You know, Africa needs to have a backbone. Africa needs to have a backbone.
Well, you know, you've been working for a very long time, and, you know, since we've known each other, to really unite Africans, their purpose, their sense of identity, and to end and diminish foreign control and dominance of African states. And I guess my question to you in this moment, and when again you're on the same mission, what's getting in the way? What's getting in the way of the Arikana Chihombori mission to end dominance of Africa, to empower Africans and unite Africans?
I think one of the biggest problems and challenges that we have, I often say, as Black people, not only Black people in Africa, but Black people around the world, we were defeated where it matters the most, which is the mind. I am going to say this honestly and sincerely, and some people may not like it, but it is our reality. We have African governments that have some members of the governments who are on the payrolls of foreign nations. We have Africans who are willing to be influenced, to be bought, to be paid in order to derail not only the continental agenda, but also agendas of their own country's development. You tell me, why is it that we have ministers of finance who come to Washington twice a year to discuss issues to do with funding for Africa, financial issues for Africa? Why haven't they come together and taken a position to truly challenge the World Bank and say, these loans that you continue to make us pay have been paid for gazillion times. They were illegally acquired. I'm encouraging everybody to read the book Confessions of the Economic Hitman, where they talk about exactly how they would force these countries to accept these humongous loans. It was all a game at the expense of the African people. Our people know that. But why aren't they standing up and pushing back and calling a spade a spade? One, we have some that are on the payrolls of foreign governments, and yet they are in the government themselves. Shame on them. Two, we have some that are just scared of those who don't look like us. Again, it's part of the legacy of colonization and the legacy of slavery. We have some serious healing to do as Africans when it comes to our minds. No other man on earth in any leadership position would tolerate the abuse the Africans are tolerating, blatant abuse. So our bigger issue is the mind, our inability to fight back, our men standing up and being men like other men around the world. A lot of it has to do with some on an individual basis, greed. Others is just the mind. We're afraid of white people. We don't want to speak up in meetings because we're afraid we'll be labeled. It's the mind. At the end of the day, for me, it is the mind that was defeated. And until the mind is awoken and the mind is fearless and the mind simply says what's right is right, what is wrong, come to the United Nations, challenge the United Nations. Go to the World Bank, challenge the World Bank with facts and knowledge of what is really going on. Call these nations out. Tell them to stop the abuse, which is blatant. These nations are not trying to hide the abuse. The abuse is blatant. So to the Africans, I say, stand up, have a backbone, speak up. And for those in power, People appointed you into positions so you can represent the people. And to the people, I say to the Africans, if a leader is not representing you well, vote them out. We are sick and tired of being misrepresented by our leadership. Vote them out if they don't represent you well at a community level in your country. Vote them out if they are not representing you well at the world stage. They know the facts. Our people are now empowered. They know the games that are being played by the Western world, by the Eastern world. They are telling their leadership, we don't want it anymore. So we are demanding leadership that's going to defend us, leadership that's going to speak up, leadership that's going to say, do unto us as you want done unto you. Our ask as Africans is a very simple one. We want the world to treat us the way they would want to be treated. And our leaders are our mouthpiece. We expect them to speak up. We expect them to defend us by any means necessary. What we need are leaders that are awoken, fearless, and are ready to defend Africa like they were mandated to do by the people.
Thank you. Well, you've set expectations very high. We'll have to see how that plays out. I want to thank the former ambassador of the African Union to the United States, Arikana Chihombori-Quao. Thank you so much for being with us. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate you. Keep up the good work.
So what's the bottom line? On paper, it just sounds great. The U.S. wants to make room for African and other nations on the UN Security Council. But here's the rub. Nobody gets veto power except the original P5. The United States, the UK, Russia, France, and China. What an outdated and anachronistic lineup of nations. Where's Brazil? Where's India? Where's South Africa? So this obsolete version of power is kind of like a slow-moving train wreck, stumbling into the future. A future where the big five have less and less relevance to the way power actually works in the world. Instead of being the architect of a new global order that brings in the new rising powers and decreases global dysfunction, America is clinging to a power arrangement from nearly 80 years ago, knowing full well that this arrangement is getting weaker and weaker. And one day, it's just going to fall over. And that's the bottom line.